Laura and I believe that to whom much is given, much is required. This is the spirit that guides our work.
The Bush Center is warm and welcoming. Built on the campus of SMU, my alma mater, we invite visitors through our doors to attend public programming that attracts newsmakers and thought leaders for important conversations around the issues we care most about.
The Bush Center is a unique asset. Having a presidential center and an institute combined is something that differentiates us from most places around the country. We're able to go where other people cannot go and access resources that other people can't access. When we talk, people listen. And when we invite, they come. And when we take on a project, we finish it.
When you walk into the Bush Institute, you'll see a quote from my presidency on the wall that summarizes the principles we're committed to. It is important that we continue to defend these beliefs.
We do that through our 3 impact centers: domestic excellence, global leadership, and our engagement agenda. Domestic excellence. To be a great country, you should have strong economic growth, great education, take care of your veterans, and develop future leaders. In global leadership, it means promoting global health, advancing freedom and democracy, and empowering women worldwide. And our engagement agenda is how we spread the word about what principled leadership is and the core values we're able to perpetuate.
The Bush Institute is making a profound difference in the world. The reason is pretty simple. We don't just do policy and research, we put it into action. Through the Presidential Leadership Scholars Program, we're training rising leaders across the country. Through the work we do on school leadership, where we work with district officials across the country to recruit, retain high-performing principals in our schools. We're helping post-9/11 veterans and their families find employment through our Vet Roadmap. We've also created the Warrior Wellness Alliance, a network of organizations that represent over 1 million veterans to address the invisible wounds of war and connect more veterans to quality care.
We wanted the Bush Institute to be a place that improved the lives of people at home and around the world. We teach young leaders from emerging democracies the skills they need to help their countries succeed. We equip women from Afghanistan and the Middle East, North Africa region with the knowledge required to become effective leaders. And we continue to ensure that women in Africa who are surviving HIV/AIDS are not dying from cervical cancer.
Following the example set by President and Mrs. Bush, these early results inspire us to do more and to help more people.
We bring people to this great campus and this great facility, but also online through our publications and thought-provoking journals. We're able to carry the messages around principled leadership and what President Bush's example means to all of us.
Having the Bush Center here is really the crown jewel of the campus. Everyone associated with SMU is extremely proud of it.
The value of the George W. Bush Presidential Center to Dallas and North Texas, outside the state of Texas, is truly incalculable.
With SMU, we've hosted conversations with His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, and with business leaders like Jeff Bezos. Our policy programs benefit from the minds and interests of SMU faculty and students.
My hope is that the Bush Center will always serve as a place where timeless principles are celebrated, protected, and promoted. We just want to make sure the next 10 years are as great as the beginning years of what we're doing here.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Executive Director of the George W. Bush Institute, Holly Kuzmich.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Engage at the Bush Center, presented by Highland Capital Management. We're really pleased to have you all here tonight to look at the future of the great state of Texas. Of course, here at the Bush Institute, we work on issues like education reform and economic growth. We work on them at a national scale, but we love our great state of Texas here, and tonight we're really pleased to be working with Texas 2036 on this event. I want to acknowledge a few people here tonight. Mrs. Bush, first of all, thank you for being with us tonight. Mike Meese, who serves on our board of directors here at the Bush Center. Mike, thanks for being here. And of course, thank you to our friends at Highland Capital Management for endowing the Engage series here at the Bush Center. They allow us to bring you great programming all throughout the year. Tonight, as I mentioned, we're partnering on this event with Texas 2036, and we're joined by Tom Luce, who is the founder and chairman of this great organization, one of my former bosses here tonight. Tom, thanks for being here. And of course, the president and CEO of Texas 2036 is my other former boss, Margaret Spellings, who we know so well here at the Bush Center. She served as our president from 2013 to 2016. She, of course, was the White House Domestic Policy Advisor and U.S. Secretary of Education. She served as the president of the University of North Carolina system before she came back here to Dallas to lead Texas 2036. So you are going to hear from Margaret in just a minute, and before we get to her, we're going to see a quick video to get briefed on the work of Texas 2036.
It's true what they say about us. Things are bigger and better in Texas, and it's not hard to see why. In 2036, Texas turns 200. By then, 10 million more Texans will call our state home. That's like building another Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio in less than 20 years. Will Texas be ready? New ideas and technologies are changing our world. Working smarter and with better data, we can preserve the best parts of Texas and expand opportunity for all the Texans who come after us. We can find new ways to make sure that Texas students enter the workforce fully prepared for tomorrow's jobs. New ways to move people, goods, and ideas across Texas and around the world. New ways for Texas to be good stewards of our lands and vast natural resources. And new ways to ensure that Texans have the opportunity to live their healthiest lives. To reach these goals, Texans will need our state government to plan a lot better and adopt modern ideas that will improve the lives of Texans. That's where Texas 2036 comes in. We're working to engage Texans in an honest conversation about our future. Together, we'll offer nonpartisan ideas and modern solutions that are grounded in research and data. Join us, and let's work together to get results for Texas.
Hello, hello. I'm Margaret Spellings, and I get to be the CEO of Texas 2036. It's so fun to be back at the Bush Center, an organization I had the privilege of leading for several years, and I feel right at home. Mrs. Bush, it's so great to see you. It's hard to believe it's been 10 years since the groundbreaking of the doggone place. But anyway, I like what you've done with the thing. To my friend Holly Kuzmich, the executive director, she's doing great things here, and it's so terrific to be here. So I also want to acknowledge Tom Luce for hiring me once again. He's helped me start my career, and now in this latest phase, who's the founder and chairman of Texas 2036. And he has once again stepped forward and after seeing a need, and we Texans are all indebted to him. My task this evening is to do a little table setting for the program tonight. We have a star-studded lineup of panelists, of leaders across key sectors in our state, and you'll learn a lot from them. But first, a little context about the Texas that we're working in today and into tomorrow, into our bicentennial, our 200th birthday in 2036. We have long enjoyed years of economic growth and prosperity due to our large and employable workforce, really 4 reasons: workforce, strong and sturdy infrastructure, a business-friendly environment, and vast natural resources. But we cannot rest on our laurels. We Texans, we braggadocios, like to talk about the Texas miracle, but we cannot be complacent. That's why we at Texas 2036 are thinking holistically across these big issues and using data to ensure that Texas continues to be the best place to live and work, as it has been for so many of us. Our organization is working broadly across the biggest issues in public policy: education and workforce, health and healthcare, justice and safety, infrastructure, natural resources, and government performance. That is, how well do we run this $250 billion enterprise we call Texas? And tonight's panelists will focus on some of those issues. Texas, as we know, is big in every single way. We have a lot of swagger. We have a lot of people, 28 million or so now, going to 40 million people over the next 16 years. We are growing and we are changing. Our people are getting older, boomers like me, and it looks like some of you all in the audience. Many of us Anglo. We're also simultaneously getting younger, and those populations are quite diverse, especially in the Hispanic and Asian communities. Sadly, those more diverse populations often have poorer education and health outcomes, something that has to concern us all. The race will be won by the state or the country that maximizes the potential of all of its people. We also have a significant urban-rural divide in our state. By 2030, 126 of our 254 counties will experience no job growth or lose jobs. When we think about rural Texas, that's 3 million of our fellow citizens, more than 18 other states. So a lot of Texans out there that are helping drive our state forward, so we have to think of them as well. In order to continue our overall prosperity in our state, we will need to add about 8 million new jobs by 2036, the same number we have in Houston and Dallas today combined. That's so we can have an unemployment rate that's about where it is now. You're going to hear our panelists, Brett Perlman and Kelvin Walker, think about that a lot. Although today, 79% of our students are graduating from high school, only 28% earn a post-secondary degree or credential within 6 years of graduating from high school, at a time when more than 3/4 of the jobs require that credential beyond high school, a number that will grow by 2036. You'll hear from Juliet Garcia and Nicole Small about that. Too bad we have been going in the wrong direction on the basics in reading and math of late. We've lost ground and lowered standards. Our recent National Education Report Card, the NAEP, shows us going in the wrong way, and that's why, thank goodness, our legislature acted last year to make some improvements there. But this is a good time for me to tip my hat to Laura Bush, who paid a lot of attention to reading, and we were on our way with some pretty good scores, and we can do it again. More and more people recognize the holistic nature of public policy making these days. Healthy people are educated people. Educated people are healthy people. That's why it's so important that we invest in our human capital. We know when it comes to these issues that the hip bone is really connected to the leg bone. We lead the nation in the number of uninsured people and uninsured children, and of course do not have very good health outcomes. There is one place that we are quite a leader, and that is in the area of cancer. And you'll hear from Peter Pisters from MD Anderson about that. It's a place that we have invented a juggernaut of innovation. Another area of concern is our state's congestion. For those of you who came here tonight in the car, I don't need to explain that to you, but especially urban areas. Our gas tax revenues are generating less revenue while we have more cars on the road. Urban commuters, all of us, spend 54 hours a year, more than a week's vacation on the road, and it costs us more than $1,000. Another important part of our state's infrastructure, especially in this modern era, is broadband. If you don't have access to broadband, as about 2 million of our fellow Texans find themselves without, it's hard to access online learning or telemedicine or many, many services. Imagine if you couldn't get online. Another place where we really need to think strategically. Finally, our rapid population growth threatens to strain our natural resources. The challenge facing Texas is to ensure the long-term viability of our natural resources without stunting the economic growth that our growing state will demand. You'll see a few factoids here about droughts of record that we're not prepared to withstand, and how our air quality is strained in our urban centers, including the one we live in here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. While these issues seem daunting, we are Texans, and if anyone can get a hold of these issues and confront them, it is us. We are blessed with the prosperity and the ability to have the luxury of being able to think long term. We are not in crisis. We can get ahead of these issues and make sure that Texas is the best place to live and work now and into the future for our children and grandchildren. Thank you.
Okay. Well, first, let me welcome our panelists. We've got two panels tonight. In the first panel, we're going to talk a little bit more about people, how we invest in people in the state of Texas. And we're really thrilled to be joined by Dr. Peter Pisters, the president of MD Anderson, Dr. Juliet Garcia, the former president of UT Brownsville, and Nicole Small, the CEO of Lighthill Philanthropy. Thank you all for being here tonight. Dr. Garcia, I want to kick off with you because education undergirds everything we do in this state in terms of preparing kids for the future. And you just told me this, 22 years as the president of UT Brownsville. So you saw thousands of students during your time there down in Brownsville and helped prepare them for the workforce. And I'm curious to know, Margaret just talked about some of the educational results in our state. Texas for a long time was known as a national leader on education. What challenges are we facing right now in terms of preparing students for college, getting them through, and getting them out on time and prepared for the economy?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here and to have this discussion with other members of this board. The Rio Grande Valley, as you know, is located on the edge of the border with Mexico and the United States. We are younger than the state of Texas. We are growing faster than the state of Texas. We are 91% Latino in the Rio Grande Valley. And for many, many years, we've been outside of the opportunity circle, is the way I'll say it. And in the last 20, 30, 40 years, you've seen a huge investment in the Rio Grande Valley of education and medical opportunities. It still has a long way to go because we've just now gotten to that trough. But it's having such great impact. So the challenges are that our own characteristics of being younger, and often that means coming to school with a low socioeconomic level, and that predicts often not your success, but your failure if you have a higher than average poverty rate, and we do in the Valley. As a matter of fact, we have twice as high a poverty rate in the Rio Grande Valley as does the state of Texas as a whole. So you've got a huge population growing quickly. Likely, they're not very well educated. They're not finishing school as they should, and yet they're hungry for an opportunity. So those are the challenges. The advantages are they're hungry, they're young, and there is this enthusiasm for learning that is just about, let me in, coach, put me in, coach, please get me off the bench, because once you give these kids a chance, there's almost no stopping them.
So you talked a little bit about the work you're doing down in the Rio Grande Valley, and you've actually had some pretty good results down there compared to the rest of the state.
Well, it's not the singular plural, right? It's a plural pronoun because lots of people have decided to work together now in the Rio Grande Valley toward the end of making sure that students are better educated, they have greater opportunities. So the reason I brought this graph is because it shows that in comparison to other parts of the state, if you look at the two bottom blues, the turquoise and the dark blue, and you add them together, what it shows is that the Rio Grande Valley is actually doing better than many of these other two groupings in the state of Texas. That is, we're going counter trend. Given those negative characteristics that I mentioned to you earlier, we shouldn't be doing as well as we are in retention rates, high school graduation rates, number of hours being taken ahead of going to college, early college, high schools, number of kids playing chess. We have thousands, and I mean 5,000 kids in the Valley infected with this wonderful disease of chess, winning chess tournaments in Dallas and in the United States. You know, so if they can do chess, they can do reading, and they can do arithmetic. So it's an opportunity that has been lost. So I wanted that to go up because oftentimes we hear only the negative, and here's clear evidence that while we haven't gotten there yet, there is a competition and an enthusiasm of partners working together to make a difference in the Valley.
So talk a little bit about those partners and how you do it, because in a lot of sectors you see any individual sort of working with their own sector and not a lot of effort to get outside of their silo. How are you breaking that down?
Well, I'll give you one example that has to do with physics, because a few years ago we started a physics department, and people were saying, "Are you kidding? Physics in Brownsville? You know, stick to your knitting. Do the essentials first." And we had these hotshot physicist professors that we had hired, and so we decided we were going to build that program. Lo and behold, those two physicists that I hired wrote a grant, got 2 more physicists. They wrote grants, got 2 more physicists. They wrote grants, and they multiplied themselves into a real physics department. And then SpaceX was looking for a place to headquarter. And we got into the bidding for SpaceX. And who would have thought that we would have met that criteria? There was lots of other criteria that had nothing to do with the university, but here's where the partnering came in. The state of Texas decided to come in and help provide some inducement to SpaceX to come in to Texas. We were in competition with other states. So Texas was in. UT System, we asked for that investment off UT System to help us lure SpaceX to the Valley. We already had the physicists there, why not? And so UT System decided to play in that game. So then we got all the local communities involved as well, the EDCs and the chambers and all of those groups. We had another advantage. They wanted to be over water. Well, we happened to be over the Gulf of Mexico. Check that off. They also wanted to be close to the equator, because who knew? But when you are shooting off a rocket, there's less drag on the rocket if you are closer to the equator. We met that criteria. Check that box off. The only thing missing was human capital. So we had a community meeting where we had folks from all over the community trying to entice then the decision makers for SpaceX to choose Brownsville as their site. Well, not Brownsville, but Boca Chica, which is right on the water, 25 miles from us on the coast. And everybody did their kind of Chamber of Commerce presentation. And then we had 8 physics students come up to speak. And now we had nerd to nerd talking, right? the SpaceX guy, well, I say that lovingly, but they could talk in this language that we didn't understand. So the SpaceX guy says, after the hearing is over, went up to our students and said, "Who are you? Where do you come from?" So the student says, "Well, we're physics students at UT Brownsville." What's UT Brownsville? Had no clue we were even there. So the student says, "You want to go see our lab?" For the next 3 hours, that's where the deal got made, because they realized that they also had the human capital ready to be part of this package. So partnerships are whatever they need to be right now in the Valley. Business, state, local, school, EDBCs, whatever it takes to make those giant leaps forward that are so necessary.
Yeah, good. So Dr. Presters, let's turn a little bit to health issues. They're pretty pervasive in this state. Talk a little bit about, first of all, just where are we in health outcomes in this state?
Well, we've got work to do. I think that's the short summary. When you look at statewide rankings, we rank at 49. And that's the painful reality of where we are now.
Who's 50th? Do we know?
Alabama. So I think that, of course, that's what Texas 2036 is all about. And when you talk about health issues, I think one of the most important things to remember is that sound economic policy is rooted in sound health policy. And that it is very, very important for us as a nation and as a state to be thinking carefully about health policy.
So as you think about so many issues in healthcare to be addressing in this state, all of them tied to outcomes, but you know, as you think about healthcare coverage, How do you, as a leader of MD Anderson, think about how you lead that system and start to tackle some of these big healthcare challenges in the state?
Well, I think, being a unique institution that has a singular focus, we are obviously focused on our mission, but we're also contributing in the context of being thought leaders on how we can really attack some of the bigger problems as a state. When you look at the healthcare system that we have, and this is not specific to Texas, it's probably best described as a sick care system because we're very good at rescue care. If you have a heart attack, you have a stroke, you develop cancer, we're really good at that. In fact, we're world leading in the case of cancer at MD Anderson. However, we aren't really focused on healthcare. And we have to pivot from being a sick care system to being a healthcare system. And that really involves us really focusing on a couple of important things, the most important one probably being ensuring that every Texan has access to a primary care provider. Doesn't have to be a doctor. In fact, it could be a lower cost provider that's managing the longitudinal health needs of that individual over time. And that would enable a focus on prevention and a lot of other evidence-based practices and the management, the longitudinal management of chronic diseases. We're talking about diabetes, hypertension, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which are significant health problems that are not optimally managed in the current system and are usually managed now when there are exacerbation of symptoms and the patient uses the emergency room for those services.
And that's happening frequently.
Exactly. Patients who don't have access or who have significant chronic illness wait until there's a crescendo event, and then they use the emergency room to receive services to manage that acute exacerbation instead of having a longitudinal relationship with a primary care provider who would be preventing much of that from happening.
Mm-hmm. So given your focus and expertise on cancer, how are we doing as a state, particularly on cancer?
I think we've got tremendous progress, especially with institutions like MD Anderson, Southwestern, and others that are doing amazing research and creating groundbreaking therapies that are benefiting patients throughout Texas and across the nation. We also see tremendous opportunities in prevention. And that when you look at the state of prevention here in Texas, we've got tremendous opportunities. The reality today is that 30 to 50% of cancers could be prevented if we could just deploy what we know works. And in Texas, that really means, for example, HPV, human papillomavirus vaccination. If we were at an event like this 15 years ago, one of the questions would be, will we ever have a vaccine to prevent cancer? Well, good news, we have one. And the challenge we have now is getting the children of Texas vaccinated. When we look at the vaccination data across the state, one of the interesting observations that we have, first of all, we rank 47th in the nation. The second thing that's really interesting, and something that we focus on, is that the highest vaccination rates are in areas of the state where we have the lowest health literacy, in the Rio Grande Valley, where when we go into the Rio Grande Valley and approach mothers with a vaccine and they learn, oh, this vaccine protects against 6 different types of cancer, their reaction is, bring it on, I want my child vaccinated. The lowest vaccination rates are in the areas of the state with the highest health literacy, in the Highland Park suburb of Dallas. And some of you are probably aware of the contributing factors behind that, the anti-vaxxer dogma that's been distributed by social media. There's concern among some people that the vaccine is really designed and is engineered in ways that will promote sexual promiscuity. These are myths, and we have to really move to an approach in the future where we use science to drive health policy, not dogma.
Well, and you and I were discussing this last week, that we at the Bush Institute do work on cervical cancer overseas, and there are many countries around the world who have higher vaccination rates than we do here in Texas.
That's right. If you look at cervical cancer, one of the cancers that can be prevented, cervical cancer will be eradicated in Australia. And that's something that we need to really recognize, see that as an opportunity. And that opportunity, it should be apparent to all of us when we recognize that we have one of the youngest populations in the nation. Only 2 states have a population younger than us. That's Utah and Alaska. And together they have a population of about 6 million. So I don't know if there's anybody here from Utah and Alaska. I don't mean to suggest that you're irrelevant. But the point is that we have a lot of children in Texas. And so the educational needs of those children and the opportunity to protect them against the ravages of cancer through a rational, science-based approach to vaccination is something that we should all really take seriously.
Margaret talked about the population of Texas and how we have both a growing young population and a growing older population. What kind of strain does that put on the healthcare system, and how do you think about those 2 ends of the spectrum?
Well, I think as we get into the older age range, fortunately, most of those patients are covered by Medicare in some way, shape, or form, and that's a huge benefit for them. Of course, the whole Medicare system was designed in many ways when life expectancy was a lot shorter than it is right now in the late 60s. And so now when we have life expectancy in the high 70s, in some cases for some subsets even into the 80s, we're looking at a longer period of risk that the federal government is exposed to over time, and that's what's creating issues with the solvency of the Medicare Trust Fund. So as we really think about the needs of the elderly population, we need to think about that from the perspective of, first of all, the long-range perspective of what are we going to do about the solvency of the Medicare Trust Fund over time. How are we going to create the right kind of resources so that elderly patients have the same kind of longitudinal access that I was describing earlier at the most important period in their lives, other than childhood? And that, I think, is something that we have to focus on as a society.
I think you should do that very quickly for some of us. We are very valuable grandparents.
And Dr. Pisters and Dr. Garcia, a connection point between both of you is the issue of creating this healthcare workforce of the future, too. And Nicole, we'll come to you on this in a minute. But Dr. Garcia, how did you think about this in terms of knowing what the needs were of the state and how you ensured you were preparing students for the jobs? And Dr. Pisters, what are the challenges you face in terms of recruiting a workforce in the healthcare sector here in Texas?
You know, when I was a baby president, I had just been named president, and you don't know what you're supposed to do. Somebody, you know, gives you this authority all of a sudden, and you're hoping you're not going to mess up too badly, and you're trying to learn what the new job is. I found the best presidents that I could find that were notorious for being really good, and I went to interview them like a good student might. And I ran into one who told me, I said, what's the most important part of your job? And I have my little notebook there, and I'm ready to take notes, and he said, preserving the democracy of the United States. I said, I'm sorry, sir, I don't understand. And he said, he was the president at that time of Miami-Dade Community College that now has 150,000 students. And he said, my job is to take that native Floridian that has not had access to higher ed, invite them into higher ed, or that next Cuban or Haitian or whoever comes to our shore. Because if I do that really well, I will invest them in the democracy of the United States. They will become productive members of our democracy. And then they will grow it, they will defend it, and then they will sustain it. So my job is to sustain the democracy of the United States. I closed my little notebook and I said, I live on that kind of border too. And so I think when I approached my job, that's what I intended to do was, what can I do to take this next generation, whatever the challenges are, and ensure that they have opportunity, not for them, for themselves, of course, for their families, absolutely, for their health, of course, but also for our nation to succeed, because that's finally, you know, what connects us all together. So during my time as president, we graduated 35,000 students. If you don't think that changes the very DNA of what the Rio Grande Valley is. And now we have a brand new university that we created from UT Brownsville and UT Pan American and merged it to become UT Rio Grande Valley, and a medical school. when would we have imagined that we'd be producing physician's assistants, and this May will graduate our first class of medical doctors. So it's a long game. It's the marathon, not the sprint. And you have to have, like the work that we're doing, I think, with Texas 2036. I think we're looking at the long-term benefit. You've got to make decisions that are generational.
Dr. Pushers, you want to add anything about the workforce you need?
This is a really important point because healthcare is so dependent on human capital. And I think that, as we think about that, we've got a need certainly to work on what I would describe as 3 areas. Strategic immigration policy, because we're so dependent on foreign talent for medical services. Secondly, massive federal investment in STEM, because we have a foreign dependency right now for these STEM fields, which is a risk. And it's also an opportunity. We need our kids to really dive in and to be supported in STEM programs for the future. And then the last point that I think is important for Texas, or for us at MD Anderson, is to use our graduate medical education programs, our GME programs, strategically for our own needs, that is for the state's needs. Right now, when I look at the individuals that we recruit to our programs, the primary filter that's used is an academic filter. Will this individual, often coming from the East Coast or the West Coast, help my research program? And as a byproduct of that, can they get clinical training? And most of those people come here, they get great training at MD Anderson, and they go back to one of those locations. We need to put a second filter on that that's more like a stickiness filter. And what is the likelihood that this individual will stay in Texas, will join our organization, will stay in our network? And that might mean us looking strategically at where are all the kids from Texas in internal medicine programs all across the United States, and how do we guarantee them slots in MD Anderson oncology programs, because those are the kids that will stay in our state.
Yeah.
So that's going to involve us really pivoting, and this is what we're building into our strategic plan. How can we modify our GME programs for our own internal needs going forward and for the benefit of the state?
Nicole, you spend a lot of time thinking about those issues. Science, healthcare, biotech, and investing in the workforce. Why have you all chosen to focus on that?
Well, first I'd like to go on record and say that I have a 14-year-old fully HPV vaccinated, just for the record.
Excellent.
And I did a little marketing experiment with her, because I don't know how many of you have kids in your life, but when you walk in and say you're about to get a shot, they don't like get real excited. So I said, we tried a marketing experiment in our house, and I said, we're gonna get a cancer vaccine today, so you won't get cancer. And she walked into the doctor and said, can I have my cancer vaccine? Yeah. And the pediatrician said, I've never had a child ask for a shot. Well. I said, well, I'm not gonna lie, she might still cry, but she did ask for it. So we're trying to up that number from 40.
Well, it's interesting that you say that. My sister's a pediatrician, and that's the technique that she uses with her patients. She first of all separates the parent from the teenager, and then says, would you like a cancer vaccination?
Yeah.
And that's a key part of the strategy.
Yeah. Well, and on that note, we can talk about the STEM workforce, but obviously keeping our kids healthy is the first thing we have to do. Right. And those are actually the kinds of projects that Light of Hope Philanthropies we get really excited about supporting, and have actually partnered with MD Anderson and ACS, particularly on the HPV vaccination issue, because it is one of the kinds of things that if we want our kids to grow up and be healthy and be productive workers, we do need to teach them about prevention. So that, I'm so glad that you mentioned that, because that is one of our favorite projects. So we have spent a lot of time at Light of Hope Philanthropies thinking about investing in our children to create the workforce for the future. As we all know, the reality of it is we actually don't even know I don't know what my 11-year-old is gonna do when she grows up, and the fact of the matter is the job she might have might not even exist yet. So what we do know is that we need to get kids excited about enthusiastic and inspired to pursue careers in STEM so that they can come to your university, so that they come to MD Anderson and pursue whatever job it is that's appropriate for them, and that you all have the workforce for the future. So it's really of critical importance that we create that pipeline, as Dr. Pisser said, and start really early, because by the time we're getting them in university, if we haven't already shown them what the opportunities might be, they might have already self-selected out. So much of the work that we're doing in sort of STEM education, revolves around helping build the Perot Museum of Nature and Science here, because we know when we talk to our Nobel laureates at our own medical school here, and you ask them what got them interested in pursuing careers in science, they can actually cite specific instances of walking through science museums when they were really young that got them inspired. And then you give them great school STEM programs, and then you send them to great universities, and you show them amazing leaders at places like MD Anderson that are making difference in people's lives every day, and give them that visibility into understanding why when they go to math class and that's kind of fun, or they do their first dissection or experiment, you've got to give them visibility into what those careers actually are. So we try to invest across that pipeline from when they're really young all the way through university. And even things like this last couple of years, we partnered with UT Southwestern to create the Lyda Hill Department of Bioinformatics. As we all know, the intersection between computational biology, science, cancer, all of these things, technology is helping us pave the way. We don't have enough people in those jobs. It's virtually impossible to hire into those positions, and Dr. Pisters can probably speak specifically at MD Anderson, but here at UT Southwestern, as we know, we're competing with Google for those kids. And so we've got to build in Texas, as he said, a pipeline of our own kids who grow up here, maybe they go away, but we have to have them come back here, because that's the future of medicine, and that's how we're going to keep people healthy. And so we like to invest, as I said, from little kids all the way to the Department of Bioinformatics, because we know those things are important. And then lastly, I'd say we're spending a lot of time right now thinking about actually helping build a more robust innovation and biotech sector in Texas. And Houston has done a pretty good job. Austin's doing a good job. North Texas has fallen. We're not doing as great a job building, I think, the business around medicine here. And so there's a lot of really exciting opportunity to build a more robust biotech sector, so that the physicians and the business people and the scientists and the people who care about those things, as Dr. Pisser said, maybe they've gone to a coast. And San Francisco's kind of cool, and Boston's okay, but Dallas and Houston and Austin are really awesome. And so we need to have jobs for them to come back to. And so it's great if, we love for people to go to the coast, but it turns out there's a lot more here than a flyover state. So there's a lot of conversation around Texas being the third coast in biotech. And so we're spending a lot of time with our own community, building an innovation sector and working with the rest of the state, because we've got to have those kinds of jobs as well.
So, Nicole, how do you think about philanthropy and its role in addressing these big challenges? Of course, there's a huge role for the public sector, especially in education and healthcare, and there's a role for the private sector. How do you view the role of philanthropy in tackling these big issues?
Well, I think it's important to remember that we need all of these things. So we need the private sector, we need government, we need philanthropy, and everybody plays a unique and different role. And we need actually everybody to jump in together to solve these problems. We have some minor issues, as we can see from the data, and it's kind of going to take all of us to jump in together. So, the exciting thing about being part of Lyda Hill Philanthropies and the team that we have is we try to use actually all of our resources to make change. And so we both use our investment portfolio as well as our philanthropic dollars, and I think that's one of the things that it's really important for people to think about, is actually how you can use those things together. And I think cancer is a perfect example of how we both use philanthropy and investment dollars to try to make change in the things we care about. So at the most important basic level would be a gift Lyda gave to MD Anderson 5-6 years ago, which was a $50 million basic research science grant. We started with that. We've got a very early stage life sciences investment fund to try to do translational research coming out of MD Anderson, UT Southwestern, hopefully out of your medical school one day. And philanthropy can do those kinds of things early because we can take high risk. And so we view philanthropic capital as early stage, catalytic, kind of game-changing high risk capital. the good news is when you give philanthropy away, you don't usually expect to get it back in terms of dollars. You hope you have social change. When you give investment dollars, you hope you get those back. We always say it's only bad when you make an investment that turns out to be philanthropic. That's not always so awesome, but it happens on occasion. So using philanthropic dollars to sometimes pilot things and try things so that government can then jump in. We can be a proof of concept for people because we can take risks. And I think most of you in the room probably know Lyda Hill, who I work for. One of our big mantras was something that Warren Buffett said to her when she took the Giving Pledge, which was, do the things that other people can't and won't do, not what they can and will do. And that's such a great role for philanthropy, to try things that other people can't and won't do.
So you've also done some work to really get organizations to think about how they collaborate and coordinate more strategically. Because in many cases, we have lots of people who are working on an issue, and it's not for lack of effort, but we're really not thinking about it and working together in a smart way. Can you talk a little bit about what you've done?
Yeah, that's my other favorite subject. Yeah, I mean, I think the short story is that, as we talked about, it takes everybody working together to make real change. And several years ago, we launched something called the Better Together Fund. And the effort there was the idea that we need to be issue-focused, not necessarily agency-focused. And we have spent a lot of time, and you talked earlier about sectors and silos, and the reality of it is we're not going to cure cancer if education and medicine don't come together, right, if we can't do prevention. And we need to operate all together and think about a more integrated approach to solving problems. And so we try to fund systems changes. We try to fund groups where we can encourage people to maybe focus on an issue and figure out how to throw all their resources against solving them. We happen to know that we're better off together, right? And so there's just not enough capital, unfortunately, in the state and this country to necessarily solve all the issues we have. But we know if we can pool that capital and work together and we use the best of everybody, we've got a lot better chance of leveraging everybody's strengths to actually make change. Because you know what, we just don't have time anymore. So you look at this data, 2036 is going to be here before we know it. I can't look at my own kids, you can't look at your students. We can no longer look at a 5-year-old and say, you know what, next generation, sorry, this isn't for you. We don't have, it takes 10 years to make that kind of change. We have to make change faster, better, quicker, and we're going to do that together.
Okay, you also, a lot of the work you do in science, you talk about the relationship to health. Say a little bit more about that.
Sure, so I think we spend a lot of time investing in things like climate and medicine. I think back to this idea of there's a lot of intersectionality between these issues. We are spending a lot of time thinking about climate, I think, as everybody is. All you have to do is turn on the news right now. And that's driving a lot of health changes, right? And I'm not gonna sit on a stage with 2 doctors and try to explain to anybody any details around how that happens. But we do know as climate warms, things like infectious disease changes, those rates change. And so when we think about science, for us, it is very much about driving improved health. And we think about that. Mrs. Bush has done a tremendous amount of work at the intersection of climate and health and green space and all of those kinds of things. So we really are thinking about science and climate, environment, and really trying to think holistically about those as we think about, as you said, trying to build a better country, a better nation, a better place for our kids to grow up on, right? We are only living in the earth we are giving to our kids. And so it's our responsibility to think about all those things holistically.
Okay, so one last question, same question for each of you in your particular field. As you think about this audience out here, what's the one thing you want them to know about the challenge we face in Texas? Who wants to go first?
Okay, well,
Dr. Garcia.
that there is light at the end of this tunnel. I was thinking about our student who graduated with her PhD from UTMB in Galveston and is growing human lungs, right? They take your DNA so that you won't reject this lung that they're going to grow for you in generative medicine. It won't be ready for 10 years, so don't hold your breath for it. But imagine, a few years ago,
We don't have time for that. Faster, better.
Right?
Tell her, let's go.
She was a freshman at our school. She is now a PhD scientist working with a team to invent human lungs and to grow them. It's extraordinary. Another young man that finished at our school and it ended up at Harvard, full scholarship, into their biomedicine program, graduated with his PhD, and started to work for a venture capitalist. I said, well, I don't understand. Why did you study science so long to now work for a venture capitalist? He said, they don't know science. And so they need for me to interpret the next best idea, science idea, that comes to them, and then they can decide whether or not to fund him or not. He's now left that and is at the medical school in San Antonio, back on the bench, because he wanted to do research. But I mean, just those two examples, and there's so many, it can happen, and it can happen in one generation. It happened in our family, where no one had gone to college, and now all of my cousins, all of us are professionals. It can happen. So it's one of hope and focus and partnership. Educate Texas is one of the groups I didn't mention earlier. They've been working with partners all over the place in the Valley, and they've targeted the Valley. And they've got teachers and principals and leaders of higher ed and K through 12 and community leaders. So together, it can happen.
It's doable. Okay, Dr. Pisters.
I think it's what I was saying earlier, that we have to create the pivot at the state level from the sick care system that I was describing to the healthcare system, and create an environment where every Texan has a primary care provider.
Nicole?
I think I would say I think use data, have hope.
Okay. Well, will you join me in thanking our first panel? Thank you. You all can head out that way. You all can get up and head out that way. Okay. We are now going to move to our second group and introduce our second panel. Now we're going to move a little bit from the people and investing in people, their health and education, and our workforce, to thinking about how we grow our economy and invest in the infrastructure of the state, and think about all the assets that we have in Texas. So I am joined here by Hunter Hunt, Chairman and CEO of Hunt Energy, Brett Perlman, the CEO of the Center for Houston's Future, and Kelvin Walker, the CEO of the Dallas Citizens Council. Thank you all for being here tonight. Hunter, I want to start with you and talk about energy, because of course, Texas is wealthy in our energy. Quantify that a little bit for us.
Sure. So we're very well known from an oil and gas perspective, and it is pretty phenomenal when you look at the state today. If we were our own country, we'd be the fourth largest oil producer in the world. We'd be behind the United States, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. We'd be the second largest producer in OPEC. So it's a phenomenal story with where we are. And we produce over a quarter of our nation's natural gas, around 25 billion cubic feet a day of gas. And we're sending over 5 of that down to Mexico right now. So it's a phenomenal story and a very stereotypical one, I think one that most people know and understand. But I don't think there's a real appreciation of the renewable revolution that's hit in this state as well. And it really started with the leadership of Governor Bush at the time, in conjunction with the Public Utility Commission, where Brett served, that launched it. But today, in a state that has 75,000 megawatts, so it's just a unit, but just remember that, 75,000 megawatts of demand at peak, we have 24,000 megawatts of wind capacity available to meet that, which is just a stunning amount. We've had multiple hours where over half of all the electricity being generated is from wind power. And we actually had a month of March, I believe it was in 2019, where 1 out of every 4 electrons that flowed across the state was wind power. And so we are, I think we'd be the 5th or 6th largest country in the world from a wind perspective. Solar, we're behind only because it's not subsidized. We've had a wonderful approach, letting markets and regulation and consumers drive demand. But we now have 2,500 megawatts of solar, again, in a system that peaks at 75,000. But we have 60,000 megawatts of solar projects that have raised their hand to say we want to connect to the grid. So as proud a history as we've had and the innovation we've had on the oil and gas side, we are truly at the forefront of the next generation of energy, and the battery technology is falling right in behind it. It's an incredibly powerful and bright story.
So that is all good news. talk about the challenges you see that we have to be prepared for in the future.
So, there's several of those. One of them is it's good news that we're at the forefront of clean energy because we have challenges with all our energy production as well. We are the #1 polluting state in the country. I had the good fortune of working on Governor Bush's campaign when he ran for president against Al Gore. And there was the political charge of we're one of the greatest polluters in the country, and the flippant response to that is, well, we can fix that. We'll just shut down all the refineries and chemical plants, and it'll all be good. And so it's a challenge because the country needs us and leans on us, but there are costs, and pollution is one of them. And so we do have 3 of the top 15 most polluted cities, but I think equally important, we actually have 20 counties that are a non-attainment zone in at least one factor of a hazardous pollutant. And so as we continue with new technologies to show up and support mobility, we're going to need to continue to support that from a policy perspective and a demand perspective. That's going to be critical. We already have been moving off of coal and dirtier natural gas plants just through market forces. That needs to continue. Our other challenge is water. And it's a big challenge because it's a big part of our energy production. But I mean, the stats were up earlier. Every single decade in the 20th century had a drought. And if we had a severe drought right now, we could only meet 75% of the state's needs. And we're about to add 10 million more people in the time frame of our 2036 project. And so it's a real challenge as we look at our oil and gas production as well as all of our energy manufacturing to figure out how do we preserve our water, how do we invest in the new technologies that help us create the clean water that every one of our citizens has a right to and needs.
Brett, let's follow on this trend and talk a little bit. You're based in Houston, of course, and energy is a significant part of the economy in Houston. Talk a little bit about how you're thinking about the future and making sure you have the infrastructure necessary to support that industry.
Well, one of the things that I did when I started at the center is to build on some of the things that I worked with Hunter on almost a decade ago, which is to sort of rethink the energy industry. And if you think about Houston, we are the energy capital of the world, but really we're the oil and gas capital of the world. But our vision is, can we become the low carbon energy capital of the world? So we have the skills, the manpower, the resources really to lead in this revolution of creating this next generation of energy. And it doesn't really matter whether you believe in climate or not, because the people, 169 countries signed the Paris Accord. And there's going to be a huge need and a huge demand for low carbon energy. So why would anyone else in the world, why would we want to cede that to anyone else in the world other than, and why shouldn't that be in Houston? So we're taking some of the things that we did and rethinking the world of energy that I did when I was on the Public Utility Commission, now thinking in Houston about how can we not only decarbonize our own economy, because we are, as Hunter mentioned, a large emitter of carbon, but then how can we learn from that and then take those learnings and then basically export all that knowledge to the rest of the globe. So it's we need to think differently about it. It's a huge opportunity for us, and that's what we're doing at the Center for Houston's Future. We're trying to create a new vision for Houston as the low carbon energy capital of the world. So that's some of the stuff we're involved in.
Okay, so Hunter talked about water. Lack of water. Of course, there's the flip side of the coin on climate issues. There's things like Harvey with too much water.
Exactly.
And thinking about resiliency. And so how are you thinking about that issue, and what do we have to be thinking about as a state on issues like resiliency?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because we have always had sort of an engineering approach to thinking about infrastructure. And we need to sort of change our framework to think about the infrastructure, particularly in a time where the climate is changing. We are going to have floods. We're going to have floods. We're going to have droughts. And so the real question is, how do we make that infrastructure resilient, and how do we recover from these events? So we shouldn't be thinking about flood control. We should be thinking about how do we live with water on the coast. And there's been a lot of work that Mayor Turner has started to do in this area in particular, and that we were involved in when I started at the center, basically to build this new paradigm around resilience that thinks about shocks, and those shocks could be anything. They could be floods, they could be droughts, they could be wind damage. We had that one during Hurricane Ike. And so you have to think about that. You're not just looking at the last problem, you're looking at all the things that could happen. And then you have to think also about the stresses. What are the things that get challenged when you have one of these events? And so an example of this would be housing. Now, you wouldn't think necessarily that housing would be linked to a flood or to a hurricane, but in fact what we saw is we saw a lot of damage to our housing stock in Houston. And so unless you're thinking more holistically about these problems, you're not going to be able to address them in this new way. So that idea of shocks and stresses is really what we're thinking about when we start to get this new paradigm of dealing with resilience in a different way.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk a little bit about transportation. Of both people, right? We love our cars in Texas and goods in this state. How are we doing on thinking about the future in terms of what we need to support this growing population and our economic growth in the state from a transportation perspective?
Well, it's really interesting because the American Society of Civil Engineers gave us a C on transportation, and we might be kind of depressed about that until we realize that the rest of the United States got a D. So I guess it's kind of like the story about the bear, right? You just have to be a little faster than the other guy.
Okay, but how do we get to being an A?
Yeah. So we have to invest more in our transportation infrastructure. Now, McKinsey did some work for 2036, and what it showed is we have about a $50 billion gap over the 25 years during this study period where we didn't invest enough just to bring us up to speed with our peers. And so there's a huge amount of money that has to be invested in our infrastructure. And this isn't sexy stuff. And in fact, in some ways, it's annoying that you can't, some road is closed or something like that. But it's vitally important in order to be able to support the state as we go forward. And it's not only the infrastructure that we have with cars, it's really our ports, it's our freight infrastructure, rails, it's things, I guess we'll talk about broadband a little bit, and it's things like flood control. So there's a lot of different areas that get incorporated into this idea of infrastructure. It's not only the fact that we can't get from point A to point B in our cars, when we're trying to go to work or trying to go someplace. It's really about thinking more holistically about all these different types of infrastructure, which all have to work together in order to create sort of this, the lifeblood, which is what infrastructure is for our state.
Okay, and how do you do that?
Well, there's a couple different things that we need to do. We need to look at new models. So one example in other parts of the country and other parts of the globe are things like infrastructure banks. So how do we engage the private sector more in making this investment? Because the amount of dollars, as I've already discussed, is so huge that our state can't really afford, frankly, to do this, on the coffers of the citizens. So we have to be a little bit smarter about how we leverage our infrastructure investments. And infrastructure banks are an example of things that have been done in other parts of the globe, in other parts of the U.S., to think a little bit smarter about that investment, really to bring Wall Street to the table to start making these investments as partners alongside of our citizens. So that would be one example of how we ought to do it.
So on infrastructure, you mentioned broadband, thinking about broadband as an infrastructure investment in our state. Why does that matter? And Kelvin, I'm going to ask you that question too. Why does investing in broadband matter to our state?
Well, think about this. We all now have our cell phones, and just think about if you go back 10 years ago when we had flip phones. I mean, think about what a difference it is that the broadband infrastructure has made to our lives, to the way we consume information, to the way we get information. We use it, it's almost like air. We use it almost in every day. And what we're starting to see is this next generation and we don't have it yet, but next generation of broadband infrastructure called 5G. And 5G is really going to start to transform the world in ways that we haven't even envisioned yet. And really for two reasons. It's much faster, and it has what the engineers call lower latency. And so the delay of those packets running across the network is much shorter, and therefore you can do more with it. And so it'll transform transportation, for example. because it will facilitate things like autonomous vehicles. And so broadband is very, very important, but what we can't do in this state is we all have to move at the same speed. We can't leave people behind, and that's really what the challenge has been, both in rural parts of the state and with certain people who aren't older people or people with lower incomes who aren't as computer savvy and really need those skills. So the real challenge with broadband is not only an infrastructure issue, it's an education issue.
Calvin, can you say a little bit about your perspective on that issue as well and why
Sure.
this is important?
I think Dallas and North Texas, as well as Houston and all of our urban areas, have had a lot of inward migration by corporate moves and people moving to the state over the last 10 years, partly because of our infrastructure, both transportation, but also our broadband within our urban core. Our challenge has been, if you look at Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio, they're all in the top 10 for households without a fixed internet connection. Dallas is #1 in the country. 42% of all people in Dallas do not have a fixed internet connection to their home. So as great as we're doing, the business issue for us becomes the folks who may not be as connected to this digital world. We may be missing out on the opportunity for the next great entrepreneur to create something through the digital economy. So as we think about how important it is, we all use it and we all take it for granted, but imagine for those of you who still have children at home, what happens at your house when Wi-Fi goes out? It's a riot at my house. And so we know that it has become the lifeblood for how we work. And as we think about everything from telemedicine to the reality that if you live in a lower income neighborhood where you don't have access and you walk into an office to get a job, they actually redirect you to go online to fill out the application. So if you don't have that access, we're not given the opportunity to really engage all of Dallas or all of Houston or all of Texas in the growth that the state has had.
What's behind that 42% that doesn't? Is it access? Is it cost? What's the
It's a little bit of everything.
of factors?
You have some people who decide to live off the grid, right? So there's a small amount of people. Then you've got the cost for some, and then in some cases it's the infrastructure. If you look at a map and some of the studies that the Federal Reserve has done, there are places not just in the rural areas, but also I could take you to neighborhoods about 6 miles from here where your phone call is going to drop. And in that neighborhood, there's a library, a brand new one, where the kids go to use the internet and it doesn't work. And a lot of it has to do with the infrastructure was never laid properly in some of our areas. And some of it based on density, some of it based on the perspective that the income per square mile may not have been there to necessitate it. But that was a decision that might have been made 20 years ago when fiber was being laid. But now we look at where we are today, everyone has a smartphone, everyone has a need for that connectivity. So, it's as much a business issue as it is how does public sector figure out ways to make sure everyone else is connected.
Let's say a little bit more about that. One of the things you've really talked about is that while we're seeing overall growth and prosperity in our state, that's not shared equally among our population. What have you been doing, and how do you, in working with the business community, think about addressing that issue?
Sure. As we've refocused our efforts at the Citizens Council to have the mantra of inclusive growth. When you look at Dallas as our key example, you can almost split the city in half at I-30, but only 15% of the tax base is south of I-30. So in terms of tax revenues, but that's 50% of the population, 50% of the land mass. So that's a great opportunity that to the extent from a business perspective, we decide that we include more people into the prosperity of this economy, through connectivity and through bringing our business community more proximate to where the challenges are. That's a way for us to make the economy even stronger with the people who are already here. I mean, I got a data point today from one of our members of the Citizens Council that over the last 10 years, 10 million people have moved, 4.5 million people have moved to Dallas over the last 10 years, to Texas. And that's equivalent of adding the state of Alabama to Texas. Not saying we're going to add Alabama to Texas. It's equivalent in population. And so, but with that comes, we've got to say, people are moving here for a job because of the great prosperity and economic opportunity here. But we have people here in Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio that we've not fully brought into all this prosperity, which means business has to become more proximate to where the opportunities are, bringing business closer to the opportunities for P-Tech and for career institutes here in Dallas, to ask our companies to say, be partners with DISD so that we can have more HVAC, plumbers, electricians, be partners with DISD for P-Tech so that we can create more students who understand cybersecurity.
And do you feel like you're making progress on that front?
We're in the early stages. Again, this is a long-term process, 2036 and beyond, so that we see those results. But I think the more that we speak to it and we become more intentional in our thoughts about how do we make sure people who have been a little more left out and locked out, we make that a business issue, that the business community is going to be better, the economy is going to be better if we bring more people into that prosperity.
So a question I have for all of you as a group is this issue of long-term planning versus sort of being satisfied with thinking about what's happening next year. Where have you seen successful examples of that, or how do you sort of think about that and getting out of the short-term satisfaction of making decisions and being smart about the long term? It's hard.
Well, if I could pile on to Kelvin's point, 'cause it's fascinating, and Dr. Joe May, who runs the Dallas County Community College District, talks about, and I can't remember if it's over a decade or slightly longer, the number of jobs have been added to Dallas, and then the inflow of migration from California and other states that have come here, which is fabulous, other than when you start to run the math, you realize we're importing all the jobs that we were creating, and we're leaving huge swaths of our existing communities behind. And so we absolutely can have record low unemployment, and you can also have people working two low income jobs to barely make ends meet, but they're employed. So, it's possible for us to be leading with, families with two children, ages 18 or under, being below the poverty line, which as a city is astounding for us sometimes to confront, at the same time that we have all of this economic growth going on. And what I will say is and this is where I do think Texas in particular is fabulous, and the last panel I think captured it as well. I think policymakers, the business community, and philanthropy understand how to get together and solve these problems. And so right here in Dallas, right now, DISD and the community colleges and UNT Dallas have gotten together with support from philanthropy, and we can actually look kindergartners in the eye and their parents and basically say, if you stay in school, you don't even have to be top 10%. We can literally move you through an associate's degree into a four-year institution and graduate free of charge. No money required to make that arc. And again, as a business looking forward, saying we need a workforce of the future, as more and more of our jobs and processes become machine-based, the skills that are required are that much more critical. To be able to look at our young children in our impoverished neighborhoods and say, it's not escaping. Actually, we're going to meet you where you are, and we're going to rethink the way that we talk about community and grow this together. It's a really exciting opportunity, but we have to execute on it. And this is where Kelvin's leadership and others has been fabulous.
Yeah. Well, one thing, Holly, I've seen is at the state level in particular, is if we can build big coalitions in the state, and those coalitions cut across what are normal divides, so putting environmentalists and business people and energy people together, bringing in economic developers from West Texas. That's how we got wind built in Texas. We made a $7 billion investment as a state in building transmission, basic infrastructure to bring wind back, the things that Hunter was talking about. And how did we do that? We crossed those divides. We made a coalition where businesses, wind developers and energy companies and environmentalists could all work together. And if we have that kind of coalition, if we can generate that same idea for all these issues, I think we can be successful. So that's how we work on these hard problems. We're never going to get the future right. We're always going to be wrong about what the future holds. But if we can start to think about these collectively, then we can start to make some good decisions.
Yeah. Kelvin, any thoughts on that sort of short-term, long-term, and how we better think about long-term and get out of that short-term cycle?
So often we think about project to project, but I always think about it also as it's like planting trees. We're going to plant trees under which we will never enjoy the shade if we think long-term enough. I think it's easy to see tomorrow I need to do X, Y, and Z, but to really have the arc of finding time to say, well, we're going to look well beyond what we can even see. It requires a lot of patience because so often, irrespective of we're in the for-profit or not-for-profit world, we're rewarded as professionals on what you do now and what you do by the end of the year. You got to have some marker. But you have to also have that long-term goal that you know will be for your successor to continue to execute. So it's a changing of our mindset and a changing of the intentionality of our mindset about it.
Brett, can I ask you about the migration, what we know about migration here in Texas? And we kind of bank on this fact that we create new Texans every day, people are moving into the state, but what do we need to be thoughtful about in terms of migration?
Well, I mean, I think one thing that we need to think about is immigrants really are our future. So we are a magnet for people coming from all over the globe. And a lot of those, and Dr. Pfister's talked about it, you know, in MD Anderson, a lot of those people are coming here because for the opportunities to create new drugs, to be part of the medical center we have. And so really what we need to do is treat that as a resource, you know, not as a problem. How do we take these people? How do we create that resource? How do we educate them? How do we provide health care? And those, if we think about that in a different way, that immigrants are our strength, I think that will be a secret weapon that we'll have in the state of Texas. And so there's a lot of work that needs to go on to do that. But that's kind of a mindset shift in how we think about the role of immigrants in our community. And, you know, there's really no going back. I mean, this has already happened. If you look at the changes, for example, in Fort Bend County, right outside of Houston, it was perhaps, you know, one of the reddest counties in the country. Tom DeLay was elected there. Now it's completely changed. You know, new judge of Fort Bend County, you know, J.P. George is an immigrant from India. And so, you know, the whole demographics have changed in a very short period of time. So that's, Stephen Kleinberg at Rice talks about as Fort Bend County goes, so goes Texas, and then as Texas goes, so goes the world. And so we're starting to see these changes already in our state, and we really should start to figure out how do we embrace them and how do we make that into a really competitive advantage. So that sort of different mindset about immigration, I think, is going to be one of the secrets of our success.
Yep. Okay. Well, to end this panel, I want to ask you the same question I did the last panel, sort of your words of wisdom, either a caution or a sense of optimism that you have on the particular issue that you really focus on. So, Hunter, as an expert in the energy sector, what's your parting words of wisdom for this group?
So my favorite definition of humility is it's not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking more of others. So it lets us Texans be very proud and braggadocious on occasion, as long as we're always thinking more of the other people that are out there. And I think as an energy industry, you know, there's a high correlation between energy use and economic development, and intuitively it makes sense. The richer you become, the more you consume to make more high-end products. But I do think there are times the industry confuses that correlation with causation. We think we create that, and the reality is it's people that create it. We're here to serve. We have a fabulous model set up in this state, really, and I can really go back to Governor Bush putting in the very first renewable portfolio standard, where they said, we want wind, here's the amount we want, we don't care how you do it, go. And it was the market and the businesses and the local communities that figured out what was the best way to do that. That's been the framework for us all along. It's been fabulous. And we have a wind in the country right now that's a bit more prescriptive than that, saying we need change and we're going to tell you what you need to do to change. And so I think if the industry can stay humble enough, and if we can keep the regulatory and political mindset we have of let's be as adaptable and agile as we can as we move through the next decade, we'll be in fabulous shape. But it's going to take vigilance to make sure that we don't fall in the trap that you see in a lot of the rest of the country where it's too prescriptive. And it's also going to take the industry reminding ourselves we're here to serve you.
Yeah. Okay, Brett?
I would say it's, look globally, act locally. I mean, we know what these big trends are in energy, in immigration, and in healthcare. For example, those are 3 big drivers of our economy. We need to start thinking about how are we going to solve those problems in our communities and across the state. And maybe those answers won't be different, will be different in every place. But if we think about these big secular trends that we know what they are and how we're going to address them in a proactive way, I think it will start the success for the generations to come.
They both stole what I was going to say.
Tell me you're a smart guy.
Actually, I think we've had great prosperity over the last 10 years. It seems like there's no end to it. Great economy, continued corporate inward moves from Dallas, Houston, Austin are all experiencing great growth. I think we should all be willing to take a short victory lap about that, but also then think about, in all of those places, how do we include more people into that prosperity? And how do we use business, really the intersection of business, philanthropy, and our public sector through policy to make that happen?
Okay. Well, join me in thanking our fabulous panelists tonight. Thank you all. And of course, thank you to Highland Capital Management for their sponsorship of this series for us. A couple of updates for you. First of all, our new special exhibit, Liberty and Laughter, The Lighter Side of the White House, is opening March 5th. We figured it was a good time to talk about the lighter side of the White House. To celebrate the opening of that exhibit, Jay Leno is going to be headlining our next Engage event here at the Bush Center on March 10th. So tickets are going to go on sale soon. Pay attention to the emails you get from us if you're a Bush Center member. If you're not a Bush Center member, go to bushcenter.org and make sure you sign up, because donors and members get first notice for all of our Engage events. And we want to make sure you're here to see Jay Leno, which I'm sure will be a sold-out event. So thank you all for being here tonight, and have a great evening.